Alright, class, today we're going to talk about the causes and effects of the American Revolutionary War in accordance with Standard 8.1.5. Alright, the first step on the path of the Revolutionary War begins with the end of the French and Indian War, which leaves Britain as the winner and France as the loser. This makes France, obviously, really upset about Great Britain. For lack of better terms, they're pretty sore losers about it. This also gives Britain pretty much all of the territory east of the Mississippi and south of Canada. However, this also leaves Britain in massive debt in order to pay for the war. Which leads us to perhaps the main cause of the American Revolution: no taxation without representation. The British felt, since the war was fought on the soil of the colonists, that the colonists should ultimately have to pay for the taxes. So they implemented the Stamp Act of 1765, which was a tax on documents, papers. They threw in the Quartering Act, which meant that that colonists had to give up their housings and property to British. They passed the Townshend Acts, which was a various array of taxes, all of which that the colonists receiving any representation from their parliament. They had no say in any of this. Britain they passed the laws, and the colonists were rendered helpless. Perhaps the next major cause of the war were some of the events that took place in Boston in 1768. The British, they sent troops to enforce the Townshend Acts. Excuse me. The British sent troops to enforce the Townshend Acts, and the colonists they refused to buy anything that imported from Britain. They embargo, whatever you want to call it, they were done. So this is where the conflict really starts to escalate here, which leads up to, in 1770, we have the first real violence in the Boston Massacre. We have a colonist who tried to throw a snowball and at a British troop, almost as a prank, and then the British troops, whether perhaps a miscommunication, they fired on the colonists, and 5 people ended up dying. Well, time passes, and in 1773, Britain decides to pass the Tea Act, which basically, it was like a giant tax on tea, and it almost kind of gave the East India Company, which was a British tea company, it gave them pretty much monopoly on the tea business in the colonists. Colonists became outraged, and they ultimately did, the Boston Tea Party of 1773. They dumped all the tea in the water. Next list of things that caused the Revolutionary War would be the Intolerable Acts, which were basically what happened with they were otherwise known as the Coercive Acts. So basically, one of several different things happened from these. First of all, the British closed the port of Boston, implemented all kinds of taxes, still without any representation. They further increased the policies made through by the Quartering Act, and then this caused a lot of suffering within Boston. They basically had no communication with the outside colonies, and this right here really is what drew a lot of sympathy from the other colonies. Which leads us to the First Continental Congress, which happened in 1774. Is really like the first meeting between the 13 colonies. First time the colonies really started to try to become unified. And initially in this Congress, they decided they wanted to try to work it out. They wanted to try to make some negotiations, but ultimately they didn't want a war at first, anyway. And then by the time the Second Continental Congress comes around in 1775, it appeared that all other options were exhausted, and that war was basically inevitable. So in the Second Continental Congress, they named George Washington the General, which sets the stage for the shot heard around the world, and the war had begun. All right, so those were some of the causes of the Revolutionary War. Now we're going to get into some effects. Now, the first immediate effect of the Revolutionary War was obviously, as you all probably know by now, hopefully know by now, was independence, which most immediate achievement of independence came through the Declaration of Independence, signed on, as you hopefully know by now, July 4th of 1776. And this is where the colonies, they formally declare their independence of Britain. They write it down on paper that they have had enough, they're done, and we're our own thing now. This gave a lot of legitimacy to the conflict, because before it was just, kind of a few battles, but this makes it an all-out war, and there's no turning back at this point. This also is the first time it solidifies the notion that if we do become independent, we do win, that we're gonna be a union and not just 13 separate, instead of the colonies becoming 13 separate countries. The next effect, if you will, of the revolution would be the Articles of Confederation. It was almost more of like, it was kind of almost like an alliance between the 13 colonies. It was signed in 1781. Like, it left pretty much most roles of government up to the colonies, or eventually the states, except for when it came to an army, there was like one national army, kind of, I guess. And it was our first governing body, our first constitution, if you will. But it ultimately got abandoned because it didn't give much power to the federal government as a whole. Like, a lot of the states just flat out ignored it. They did whatever they wanted. So eventually, like, the leaders got together, and the Constitution, as you see today, was implemented. The next effect of the Revolutionary War would be the Treaty of Paris, which was signed in 1783, and this is where basically the rest of the world officially recognized the U.S. independence. In the Declaration, this is where we said we're independent, we're done. The Treaty of Paris, this is where the rest of the world agreed, basically, that the U.S. is its own thing. Also, after signing this, we did not just have the 13 colonies, we significantly gained in size. We got basically all the territories east of Mississippi, south of Canada. Basically, Britain pretty well relinquished all their territories at this point. A very generous deal, which helped them in a lot of ways, because immediately after the war, it gave them a lot of favor in our eyes, and we were good trading partners with them for a while, pretty well up until the War of 1812. And then in the also a more, like, I guess, a world effect would be in the larger Peace of Paris. Spain retains Florida, and France really didn't get anything out of it, despite having a huge role in the conflict. They essentially really won the war, but the only thing they really got out of it was a massive amount of debt. They did get their revenge on Britain from the French and Indian War, but they got a massive amount of debt, and not really in the end, due to the favorableness of the Treaty of Paris, not really in the end a big alliance with the U.S. like they wanted. So the only thing they got was revenge and massive amount of debt. Poor France. This did, however, inspire in their population a lot of the ideals that ends up bringing about for them the French Revolution, which we will talk about later. Alright, now to our production tasks. We are going to get into groups of 4 and create a skit based on a particular event that happened during the Revolution. This skit is to be 2 to 3 minutes long. Each group must pick a different event, and the skit, be creative with it, but it must be historically accurate, and each student must speak for at least 30 seconds. And right here are a possible lists of production tasks you can do about the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Continental Congress is on there, either one, Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, Treaty of Paris, or something else that I failed to mention, but make sure it's cleared with me first. Alright, here is the rubric, and last but not least, here's the credits. Hope you enjoyed. Have a fun time with your skit.